In the process of investigating cases involving America's most dangerous criminals, who often hide behind a facade of religiosity and righteousness, it can be incredibly challenging for law enforcement officers to adhere to all formal procedures and protocols. The temptation to compromise with the law and resort to prohibited methods can be very strong. However, this approach carries a serious danger, the risk of crossing the line of the law oneself and becoming a criminal. That is why today's story demonstrates how critically important it is to strictly follow all established rules and procedures during an investigation, so as not to create even more problems and not multiply the number of opponents of the law while trying to uncover the initial crime. Heather Quan's birthday was supposed to take place on December 25, 2006. On this day, the girl was turning 21 years old. She planned to spend this celebration with her boyfriend named Ryan Waller, and then visit his parents. The young man was slightly younger than Heather. At that time, he had turned 18 years old. He entered the college where the girl was studying. Ryan was considered a gifted young man who played the guitar well. Shortly before these events, he moved out from his parents' place. Despite this, Ryan continued to get along with his family and maintained excellent relationships with all its members. At that time, Heather also moved in with Ryan into his apartment complex in Phoenix, Arizona, USA. Prior to this, a neighbor had lived with him for a long time. But when that person moved out, the space became available, and Heather decided to take advantage of this opportunity. The girl was very happy and excited that she would finally be able to live with her boyfriend. The couple had a wonderful relationship, despite the fact that they seemed like completely different people in terms of their worldview to many. Heather had already managed to graduate from high school and entered college, where she was studying law. According to the description of those close to her, Heather was an incredibly kind and compassionate girl, always trying to help, support, or at least cheer someone up. The young man was considered more restrained but seriously focused on the future. He also entered the same college. Despite the differences, the couple looked very harmonious. It seemed that they complemented each other, and the differences did not become a cause for misunderstandings. The couple's life together immediately turned out well. They had been living together for a month and a half already. On December 25, 2006, everything was ready in the young man's family. They were waiting for them for dinner. The table was set, but the birthday girl and her boyfriend were missing. Heather and Ryan did not arrive on time. The young man's family became worried, because such behavior turned out to be uncharacteristic for the couple. They were never late. But at first, the relatives decided not to raise the alarm and wait for some time, starting the festive dinner without them. The relatives hoped that the lovers were spending time together and lost track of time. Then, when the couple still wasn't there, they started calling Ryan's mobile phone, but he ignored the calls. Of course, this was a very important day for the family, so the relatives began to worry. They knew that the young man with his girlfriend would never miss the festive dinner, which was arranged not only on the occasion of Heather's birthday but also coincided with Christmas. Although Ryan's relatives had already started the meal, they decided to tear themselves away from the food, because they literally felt anxiety. Ryan's sister said that during the day she had driven to her brother's apartment, but no one opened the door for her. At that time, she did not perceive it as something strange, thinking that the couple was simply not at home, but now it seemed suspicious. It turned out that the family had not seen the lovers for 2 days already. Ryan's mother turned to the police station, asking to check on the young people's condition. The police officers were very busy with other cases that evening. Traditionally, the number of calls increases during the holidays. Since the reason initially seemed trivial, the patrol officers did not prioritize it. Therefore, they had to wait. The police officers arrived at the specified address only a few hours later. By this time, the concern of Ryan's parents had reached its peak. The father was already waiting for the officers near the apartment of the residential complex where the couple lived. Here, the man became even more alarmed, because his son was ignoring not only calls to his mobile phone but also knocks on the door. Heather was also not responding. After several attempts to get through to the young people, which turned out to be futile, the officers had only one way out. The police officers decided to break down the door. Once inside, everyone immediately realized that something terrible had happened. Ryan was found in the living room. He was brutally beaten, had broken eyes and a swollen face. There were torn wounds on his nose. However, the young man was still alive. It seemed that he was in a state of shock. Ryan could barely move and had difficulty answering the police officers' questions. They asked him about the girl. He said that she was sleeping in another room. But when the police officers went there, they found her lifeless. Heather was lying on the couch with a gunshot wound to the head. She had also suffered similar injuries as Ryan. Obviously, she had been beaten. Most of the blows were to the face, because it was all in abrasions, bruises, and wounds. The cause of death was a gunshot wound. The police officers immediately suspected that Ryan was involved in what had happened. The officers reasoned logically. First, he was the only one who remained alive in the apartment. Secondly, it turned out that Ryan had not received such serious injuries compared to his girlfriend. In addition, no signs of a break-in were found. The young man was behaving strangely. He had difficulty with coordination and speech, which only increased suspicions of his guilt. The law enforcement officers decided that the young man did not need medical assistance. Ryan was immediately put in a patrol car, and then they continued to inspect the crime scene. From the first seconds, he became the main suspect. Heather could no longer be helped. She had been dead for a long time about a day ago. Ryan behaved unusually from the very beginning. He was speaking incoherently. The police officers could not understand what had happened here at all, because Ryan insisted that he did not remember anything. It was obvious that he had spent many hours in this house next to Heather's body. The officers assumed that during this time he could have used it to try to hide what had happened, but he did not have time. Perhaps because the parents had raised the alarm and called the police. Instead of going straight to the police station, Ryan was first kept in a patrol car. According to the young man's father, named Don, it took about 4 or 5 hours before his son was finally taken to the station early in the morning and interrogated. At the station, Ryan's clothes were taken away under the pretext that they needed to be analyzed in the laboratory. Instead, he was given a thin cotton suit. He was officially informed that he was a suspect in the murder. From the very beginning, Ryan faced a detective named Paul Dalton, who completely ignored the fact that the young man could have received some serious injuries. He was not even examined by medics. At first, the guy was simply taken to the interrogation room and left alone. He did not look tense or agitated. Rather, he did not understand what was happening. He spent the first few minutes with his head on the table, muttering something incomprehensible under his breath. On the recording from the video camera that recorded everything that was happening, it was seen that he was talking to himself, but it was impossible to make out a single word. After about half an hour of such torment, an officer entered the room, and the interrogation began. The suspect was read his rights and asked if Ryan understood why he was here. The guy replied that he had no idea. He wanted to sleep and admitted that his head hurt very badly. Paul Dalton immediately started putting pressure on the detainee. Ryan insisted that he had no understanding of what had happened in his apartment. It was noticeable on the recording that Ryan was confused, depressed, or feeling unwell. He seemed to be barely able to string words together into sentences. Obviously, as a psychological defense, Ryan backed into a corner and sat there with his knees pressed against his chest, like a frightened kid. He repeatedly said that he just wanted to go home. However, Paul Dalton had other plans. He was going to get a confession from him about the murder. The longer this interrogation lasted, the stranger the suspect behaved. Ryan simply forgot his girlfriend's name. He could not answer this question. No matter how hard he tried, Ryan could not correctly pronounce her last name. At one point, he decided it was her nickname. Ryan could not state her age. He was sure that Heather was 16 or 17 years old, despite the fact that she had turned 21. When the police officer asked him about the bruise under his eye, the interviewee also pondered the answer for a long time but could not remember what had happened. In the end, he said that he might have had an argument with his girlfriend, and it was she who hit him. Perhaps such behavior was associated with the injuries sustained or the young man's condition. But this seemed unconvincing to the detective. He was sure that this was just Ryan's way of trying to fool him. After that, Ryan forgot his girlfriend's name again. He started telling the police officer that he was attacked by either Christina or Alicia. Given the strange answers, it was obvious that something was wrong with Ryan. He had difficulty stringing words together into sentences. He had large gaps in his memory. However, the police officer simply ignored this fact. He was convinced that the young man had been hit in the face, and that was it. He had no serious injuries. Paul Dalton neglected his behavior during the interrogation, continuing to suspect him of trying to lead the investigation into a dead end. Meanwhile, it was obvious from the recording that Ryan was behaving immaturely. He kept repeating that he wanted to go home and sleep. He needed to rest. It seemed that Ryan was not aware of what was happening. However, he was forbidden to go and rest. No one was going to let him go home. After a few hours, Ryan had a new version of events. It seems he remembered something, so he started talking about an attack by robbers. Despite the fact that he remembered that his girlfriend was dead, he named a young man named Richie and his father Larry as the cause of this. For some time, Richie had lived here before Heather moved into this apartment. According to the detainee, the pair of attackers started shooting after breaking inside. Now the young man's version had undergone significant changes. He insisted that Richie had attacked him. Ryan did not realize what was happening, but he remembered that these people had broken into the house to take some things. At first, the young man could not remember the weapon with which these individuals broke in. Then he began to talk about 2 revolvers that the criminals used. One of them became the murder weapon for Heather. Despite this, Ryan made a statement that surprised the police officer. He reported that they not only shot at Heather but also at him, and the bruise on his face was actually related to the fact that he was aimed at with a revolver. This fully explained the behavior of the young man, who could actually be on the verge of life and death all this time while in the interrogation room. His infantile behavior, memory lapses, incoherent speech, and desire to constantly lie down or go out were easily explained by the injury he received. We were talking about a truly life-threatening wound, since there was no exit wound for the bullet. If Ryan was telling the truth, then it was still in his head. Obviously, he could be suffering from internal bleeding, which could kill the guy. However, for the detective, all this sounded unconvincing. Paul Dalton focused not on the probable injuries of the young man, but on the fact that he changed his testimony several times. For the detective, this fact became a sign of obvious lies, attempts to confuse the investigation. His suspicions only intensified, so the interrogation continued, despite the behavior and condition of the young man. The investigator did not believe a single word of the suspect. He believed that if he had really been shot in the eyes with a revolver, Ryan would simply not be talking to him now and would be dead, just like Heather. At the same time, it was obvious that the complex of symptoms experienced by the detainee indicated a traumatic brain injury. All this was characteristic of such situations. The police officer should have known this perfectly well because all law enforcement officers undergo special training. Determining the presence of a traumatic brain injury is not difficult, especially with such obvious signs. Every police officer has these skills, but Paul Dalton simply refused to believe it. He thought that they were trying to deceive him. He continued to insist that Ryan had to participate in the interrogation and that they would not let him go home. No one would let him sleep. Instead, he only increased the pressure on the young man. The investigator tried to restore the chain of events, clarify the information, and at the same time identify contradictions that could indicate the fairness of the suspicions. Questions poured one after another. They tried to find out from Ryan who the attacker shot first, whether he called the rescue service, why he still could not contact the rescuers, why he did not answer his parents' calls and did not open the door for his father. But at that time, Ryan was fighting a hemorrhage in the brain, which was gradually killing him at that moment. Despite the fact that he could not even remember what he had for breakfast, the interrogation continued. Ryan realized what was happening. Of course, he understood his unfavorable position and began to try to convince the detective that he was telling the truth. Finally, Ryan made a new, desperate attempt to prove to the police officer that he was not a murderer. He walked right up to him and looked straight into his eyes. At that moment, the investigator noticed that the young man's eye was really shot through. Then he believed the guy and decided to take him to the hospital. It was necessary at least to make sure that the young man was all right. At the same time, the police officer did not take it seriously. He did not even support or help the young man to go outside. Ryan continued to walk to the exit on his own with a bullet in his head, leaning against the wall. Only outside did the paramedics put him on a stretcher and take him to the hospital. Ryan was taken to a medical facility. The medics quickly found out that his condition had significantly worsened due to the actions of law enforcement officers. He should have received help immediately after being found in the apartment. At least 7 to 8 hours ago. The doctors found a bullet in his head, a hemorrhage, but the worst thing was that Ryan could no longer be operated on because an infection had progressed in his head by that time. It was necessary to cope with the infection before the operation became safe. As a result, the bullet from the victim's skull was able to be removed only 3 days later. All this time, Ryan suffered from pain and cognitive problems. On December 28th, the victim was operated on. It took over a month for further recovery, during which the young man remained in the hospital. Unfortunately, the bullet and subsequent miscalculations in the police officer's behavior led to serious, irreversible damage to the brain, part of which was infected and simply ceased to function. The guy's left eye also could not be saved. But the worst were the seizures that the neurosurgeons discovered. They began during the recovery period. According to the medics, the guy would be haunted by them for the rest of his life. The neurosurgeons were convinced that if the police officers had immediately taken the victim to the hospital, the severity of the consequences could have been significantly reduced. Perhaps it was even possible to completely avoid such problems that he would now have to live with. Interestingly, the medics even discovered a fracture of Ryan's jaw, which, according to his own words, was done by the police officers. He behaved childishly and strangely, and this irritated the detectives. It is not excluded that this intentional or accidental blow to the face only worsened the situation with the bullet in the head. One way or another, the medics, having performed the operation and observing the recovery process of the young man, repeatedly emphasized that the behavior of the police officers caused very tangible harm, which could have been avoided. Meanwhile, the detectives continued their work. Paul Dalton finally realized his mistake and decided to make every effort to uncover the truth about the crime. The investigator managed to lift the veil of secrecy over the incident that happened to Heather and Ryan. As it turned out, the events began 2 days before the police arrived. On December 23, 2006, the couple spent the whole day at home. They ordered pizza. Everything was normal and did not stand out against the background of ordinary days. But, according to the neighbors, after the pizza delivery, the former neighbor Richie came. He had a conflict with Ryan. After a short verbal altercation, the young people simply dispersed. The couple were decent young people, far from crime, who did not suffer from mental problems or bad habits. They led a completely calm, measured life. Richie, on the other hand, was known in criminal circles, repeatedly held accountable for various offenses, but did not appear in serious crimes. The police officers suspected that the attack was carried out by Richie. His name was just mentioned by Ryan during the interrogation. Perhaps this attack was related to revenge. In general, Ryan's memories were still fragmentary and incomplete. Ryan helped the investigation restore the picture of Heather's last days of life no longer as a suspect, but as a witness and victim of the attacker who miraculously survived a shot to the head. There were no other witnesses to their activity during these days. This was facilitated by the location of the house. It was located at the end of a dead end, which made it a secluded place. The police officers assumed that the attacker attacked the victims between December 23rd and December 24th. Ryan, as before, could not help fully restore the entire chain of events, since he had gaps in his memory. He pointed to Richie, but the suspect refused to admit guilt. No evidence was found against Richie at the scene of the tragedy. All hope remained on the memory of the one who survived. The motive seemed incomprehensible. The young people did not have any expensive valuables for the attacker to want to rob the defenseless couple of students with a weapon. It took time to restore the events. Neurosurgeons believed that Ryan was still in the process of rehabilitation, even after being discharged from the hospital after a month. Therefore, they hoped that he would still be able to help the investigation by recalling some details later. This really happened a few hours later, when the young man's condition improved a little. According to his memories, on December 24th, Heather and he himself woke up in the apartment in the morning. It was their usual day. On the eve of the Christmas holidays, everyone was in high spirits. In addition, the lovers were going to go to the guy's family to celebrate the girl's birthday and Christmas. Ryan remembered that in the morning hours he was in the kitchen with his girlfriend. Suddenly Heather heard a knock at the door. Although they were not expecting guests, and this seemed strange to them, Ryan went to the door to see who had come. When he opened the door, he saw his former neighbor Richie and his father Larry with weapons in their hands. He tried to close the door, but did not have time. The attackers shot him in the left eye. He fell and lost consciousness. The two men went to the next room, where the girl was sitting on the couch. They attacked and shot Heather. Richie and Larry stole some valuables and a computer from the apartment. The survivor remembered that the former neighbor was very jealous of him. It was noticeable to the naked eye. They constantly had conflicts, including over Heather. Because of this, Ryan suggested that he move out. He wanted to get rid of not only the problematic neighbor, but also to connect with his girlfriend. This greatly angered Richie, who left the old neighbor on a hostile note. The police officers could not say exactly what caused the attack, but Ryan's story sounded quite plausible. Only the criminal could confirm it. The official version sounded like robbery, because some things and a computer really disappeared from the house. Most importantly, Richie had an accomplice, Larry, who turned out to be his biological father. It was assumed that they wanted to commit a theft. But it is not excluded that this penetration into the house was primarily motivated by revenge. Several witnesses said that Richie repeatedly came to his old house, quarreled with Ryan, and even threatened him. But Ryan did not take his threats seriously. Contrary to expectations, he and his father decided to break in with a break-in. Each had a revolver ready for battle. Unfortunately, Ryan could not remember whether the shooting at Heather and himself was the result of an attempt to drive out the intruders. Therefore, it was unclear whether this robbery went wrong, after which the shooting began, or the intruders initially broke in here to kill. The second version seemed more likely at some point, since Ryan and Heather were both unarmed, and the attackers started shooting right from the doorstep. According to the forensic expert's conclusion, Heather died instantly as soon as she was shot. She was probably disposed of as an unwanted witness. Ryan was much luckier, since the bullet could not penetrate deep into the brain, so he simply lost consciousness. The attackers probably decided that he was dead and left. No one finished off the wounded. The intruders simply grabbed the first valuables that came to hand and left the scene of the tragedy. They acted quickly, so it all took literally a few minutes. Ryan, on the other hand, remained unconscious for several hours. After he came to his senses, his brain was affected, and he no longer realized what was happening around him. He even thought that Heather was just sleeping on the couch and did not bother her. Therefore, he himself went to bed and slept most of the time, not understanding what had happened. Thus, the time intervals turned out to be even more traumatic for Ryan than it seemed. He lay unconscious in the apartment near the deceased girl for many hours. After the arrival of the police, he was kept in a patrol car for another 5 hours. The interrogation lasted for several hours until the police officer finally noticed that Ryan was really wounded and needed help. Since then, he had not received emergency assistance for about 7 hours, when every minute counted. Why Detective Paul Dalton did not immediately notice a gunshot wound in the main suspect remained a mystery. Moreover, the wounded man told him about it. It was also terrible why he constantly ignored his behavior. It became obvious to every person who communicated with Ryan that something was wrong with him. According to the instructions, in such situations, a police officer is obliged to seek help for a medical examination. But this time, Paul Dalton insisted that until the last moment he thought they were trying to deceive him. Ryan was behaving very suspiciously. He was the only person who saw Heather up until the moment of her death. It seemed that there was no one else in the apartment. In addition, such incidents are often associated with the closest people, so it was obvious why he became a suspect. It should be noted that this information was obtained only after Ryan's discharge. This means that Richie and his father Larry, two bloodthirsty murderers, continued to roam free for at least a month. At the same time, the detectives practically did not communicate with Ryan during his recovery in the hospital. Miraculously, the murderers did not commit new attacks, although both were well known in criminal circles. True, before this incident, they did not have any similar violent attacks, let alone murders. Of course, the killers had no idea that Ryan was miraculously able to survive this attack. The police officers did not disclose this information and data about the survivor, since there were serious concerns that the thugs could return and get rid of the only witness who could put them behind bars. Finally, Richie and Larry were detained and taken into custody. They found some of the stolen valuables from Ryan's apartment, as well as 2 revolvers. Later, with the help of ballistic examination, it was proven that Richie shot Ryan and Larry shot Heather. In the end, Richie was charged with murder, burglary, aggravated assault, and illegal use of weapons. He received life imprisonment without the right to parole. His father was also found guilty. At first, his wife said that he confessed to her about killing the couple, but then he got scared and refused to testify in court on the side of the prosecution. In fact, his own mother was not afraid and testified against Larry. The prosecutor's office had more than enough incriminating evidence. The jury found the man guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated assault, and robbery. He was also sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. A few years after the conviction of the murderers, Ryan's father, Don, filed a lawsuit against the Phoenix Police Department. The man watched his only son suffer for years. After the incident with the attack and the police, he suffered from seizures, cognitive disorders, and constant headaches. Don accused Paul Dalton of falsifying evidence and creating his own versions of the case, which he desperately tried to prove. As it turned out, the detective had a controversial professional history. He did not always play by the rules. Unfortunately, Ryan did not see the results of these hearings. The guy lost his left eye and part of his brain. This greatly affected him. He could no longer live a normal life and was completely dependent on his parents. The guy, who miraculously endured a shot to the head and the pressure of the police, died from one of the seizures 10 years after the attack, on January 20, 2016. He fell and received a brain injury that turned out to be fatal. Of course, this whole sad situation attracted the attention of the local media. But Ryan's father and mother kept their distance from journalists. Don gave only one interview, talking about how he was trying to get justice for his son. He was convinced that Detective Dalton had finished what the attackers could not do, namely cause the death of his son. The outcome of this case is still unknown. So, this chilling story about the murder of Heather Quan and the attempt on Ryan Waller's life, unfortunately, is not an isolated case. It vividly illustrates how easily young lives can be cut short due to someone's anger, envy, and cruelty. Ryan's former neighbor Richie and his father Larry brutally dealt with the defenseless couple, apparently motivated by revenge and self-interest. However, the most outrageous thing in this story is the behavior of Detective Paul Dalton, who, due to his bias and unwillingness to understand the situation, almost brought the only witness of the crime, the wounded Ryan, to death. If the police officer had paid attention in time to the obvious signs of a serious injury and provided the young man with the necessary medical assistance, perhaps Ryan would not have suffered from such serious consequences and would have lived longer. Summing up this tragic story, we can bitterly state that it is a vivid example of how, due to human cruelty, envy, and anger, young lives filled with hopes and dreams can be cut short. Heather Quan and Ryan Waller became victims of a senseless and insidious crime committed by Ryan's former neighbor Richie and his father Larry. These cruel and heartless people broke into the loving couple's home and shot them, most likely motivated by a desire for revenge and enrichment. However, the most outrageous and unfair thing in this story is the behavior of Detective Paul Dalton, who, due to his prejudice, unprofessionalism, and unwillingness to understand the situation, almost brought the only witness of the crime, the wounded Ryan Waller, to death. Instead of providing the young man with the necessary medical care and carefully questioning him, the detective subjected Ryan to a harsh and exhausting interrogation, ignoring the obvious signs of a severe head injury. If Paul Dalton had timely fulfilled his professional duty and provided the wounded man with proper medical care, perhaps Ryan would not have suffered from such serious consequences and would have lived longer. and not died 10 years later from complications. This sad story is a reminder to all of us of the enormous responsibility that law enforcement officers bear for the lives and destinies of people. We entrust them with our safety and protection, so we have the right to expect professionalism, objectivity, and adherence to the law from them. Unfortunately, mistakes and abuse in the work of law enforcement agencies happen too often and can have fatal consequences, as in the case of Ryan Waller. Society must draw appropriate conclusions from this tragedy and make every effort to ensure that such a thing never happens again. We must demand justice, transparency, and accountability from the justice system, and high professionalism, honesty, and respect for human rights from law enforcement officers. Only under such conditions will we be able to build a safe and humane society where every life is valued and crimes do not go unpunished. Let the untimely death of Ryan Waller and the tragic death of Heather Quan serve as a reminder to all of us about the fragility of human life and the need to protect each other. And those guilty in this terrible story, both the killers Richie and Larry, and the unscrupulous Detective Paul Dalton, must bear a just and severe punishment for their crimes. Concluding my story, I want to thank you for your attention and concern. If you are interested in this story and want to learn more about high-profile crimes, their investigation, and human destinies, I invite you to subscribe. Here you will find many exciting, dramatic, and instructive stories that will make you think about the eternal questions of good and evil, justice and mercy. Join our community of like-minded people who believe in the power of truth and the inevitability of punishment. Together we can make our world a little safer and more humane. Thank you for caring.